So my talk today is on this portrait of a boy that is, I think, one of the most arresting, partly because it's so strange, images in the gallery. It's a picture that virtually everyone who comes through this space stops at and has a look at. He's affectionately known as the boy in the great green hat, or even more affectionately to some of the curators, we refer to him as Frog Boy. For I think some of the obvious reasons. Nonetheless, it is a striking picture, and it's a picture about which there's a great deal of mystery and recent discovery or recent questioning, and it's that which I want to go through today. We don't know exactly who painted the picture, nor, as it turns out, do we know exactly who the picture is a portrait of, and therein lie the two great mysteries. What we do know is that it's a portrait made at the Spanish court in the late 16th century. The style of the picture, the format of this portrait with someone in very fancy dress against this dark gray background, the kind of portrait it is tells us immediately that this is Spanish court, late 16th century. This is a court that was moving around. It could have been painted in Valladolid. It could have been painted in Seville or Toledo. This is before the court is settled at Madrid. So it's painted in Spain in late 16th century. It is certainly a boy of aristocratic standing. He is wearing this very fancy costume with a gold clasped belt. He carries this jeweled dagger. He has some sort of medallion on a ribbon around his neck, the high lace ruff. And then, of course, as I've mentioned before, that great green hat. He is wearing very expensive clothes, and I'm told by the clothing experts, these are distinctly hunting clothes. Not that anyone actually expects him to be running around the woods in this garb, but it is a ceremonial version of a hunting costume, the sort of thing that an aristocrat would wear when out at one of the smaller country palaces for his I know it's hard to believe this, his portrait in the mode of relaxation. Hence the dagger, hence the spear, hence the hunting hat, as it were. Although, of course, this is all a great put on this boy, who probably is, we think, 4 or 5 years old. The age is a little bit hard to tell because he's treated as a miniature grown-up, is not actually going out hunting with that spear. It's a ceremonial portrait, and it probably was made along with portraits of the king and the elder princes, also in hunting costumes, something that continues through the history of Spanish portraiture. You can think of all those portraits Velázquez makes of King Philip IV in the next century in hunting costume. Oddly, for a portrait made in Spain, presumably of a Spanish aristocrat, the inscription up here is not in Spanish, but is in Italian, and reads Filippo, P, standing for Principe di Spagna, Spain in Italian, figlio di Carlo V Imperatore, that is to say, Philip, the Prince of Spain, the son of Charles V, the Emperor. Well, that would suggest that this is a portrait of King Philip II as a young boy. He was the son of the Emperor Charles V, although that's impossible. This would have dated the painting to the late 1520s. Philip II is born in 1524, I believe. And it's categorically, by the style of the painting, by the dress with this high lace collar, it has to be 40 or 50 years later than that at a bare minimum. So it was long thought that this could instead have been a mistake by whichever Italian painted that inscription, that it was in fact supposed to be Philip III rather than Philip II as a young boy. That makes a certain amount of sense. The timing would be right. Philip III is born in the 1570s. And what's more, Philip III's sister, Catalina Michela, the Infanta Catalina Michela, in 1585 marries the Italian-speaking court of Savoy and moves to Turin in northwestern Italy. We know that this picture was recorded in inventories of the Savoy collection in the 17th century, and it came to light in an auction in Nice, which is basically the next closest city to Turin to the court, in the early 20th century. So it would seem that this picture was likely to have been carried away to the court of of Savoy at Turin by Catalina Michela when she marries that court in 1585, moves there in 1586. Hence the Italian inscription, which is very old but not original to the picture. But then there are some problems with that inscription and that identification, which have to do partly with the style of the painting. It does look like one of the Habsburg princelings. It could be Philip III. He has what I think is fair to say is a very distinctive Habsburg physiognomy. You can compare him, for example, to his brother, Don Carlos, the ill-fated Don Carlos. This painting done in the 1550s. Who painted this is also an open question, which I'll return to. You might even compare it to the portrait of the young princes Don Diego and Don Felipe, that is the future Philip III, a portrait that's in the Descalzas Reales in Madrid, done again in the late 1570s or possibly 1580. However, when one goes to the Prado today and sees portraits such as that of Philip II, the father of all of these chaps, the attributions of these pictures have changed, and research done in the last 10 years, in Spain especially, suggests that this picture of Philip II, which bears an obvious relationship in its every detail to this painting, was done not by Alonso Sanchez Coello, the person to whom all of these pictures were once attributed, but is instead by Sofonisba Anguissola. Now, Sanchez Coello is the court portraitist under Philip II and Philip III. He comes of age in the 1550s. He's born in the 1530s, comes of age in the 1550s, and until his death is the primary portraitist at court. But he has a very distinctive style, one that is characterized by, I think it's best seen in the portrait of Catalina Michela, which we are certain is by Sanchez Coello, a rather sharp chiaroscuro. He likes to paint things with bright distinctions between the bright areas and the dark areas. And these new pictures, or these pictures that have been newly reattributed at the Prado, like the Philip II, are something softer. Now, I realize with my photocopies you're going to have to take my word for this, but I'm asking you to take my word for a lot of things, and I'm happy to give you references to the pictures or to send you to the Prado to make up your own mind. But the Philip II, which is so much more subtle, so much more delicate, it doesn't have that starkness, that crispness of Sanchez Coello's portraits. That softness and that morbidity is everywhere present in this picture as well. From every detail to how the lace is painted, where you don't have deep shadows between each fold, but instead a very gradual shading from the bright highlights at the edge down into the middle tone grays inside, to the way the face has a kind of smoothness to it rather than the almost lapidary quality that you get in Sanchez Coello's portraits, even to the gray background, which despite its damages, you can see is slightly modulated with a bright area here that then goes darker on that side of the picture, which again is something we see in the portraits now attributed to Sofonisba in Spain. Now, Sofonisba is a fascinating character. She is one of the few women to attain prestige, notoriety as an artist in the Renaissance. Most of the other female painters of whom we know were daughters of artists, people like Artemisia Gentileschi or Lavinia Fontana. Sofonisba, however, was from a fairly well-to-do family and just showed talent as an artist, and so kind of became a glorified amateur painter. She is from Cremona in northern Italy or central Italy, and began painting portraits of people around Lombardy, including at the court in Milan. And while there, one of her major patrons is a Spaniard who sees to it that Sofonisba is invited to the Spanish court. She travels to Madrid in the 1550s, and she becomes not the official painter, the royal painter or anything like that, but a lady-in-waiting to the queen, first the Infanta, then the queen. She is one of these cultured women who attends the queen, and she was cultured. We know that she was interested in literature and music as well as painting. But of course, while there, she continues to paint portraits. the difficulty is that because she's not an official painter, you don't have records of payments. You don't have contracts signed the way that you would with a royal painter. What she painted, she just painted. Everyone in the court at the time would recognize these, but no one coming along later is able to find a document to substantiate what is by Sofonisba as opposed to those paintings done by Sanchez Coello. Now, Sofonisba is there in Spain from 1558 to 1573. And herein we get back to the difficulties of identifying this young boy. Because if it is by Sofonisba, which I'm convinced it is, it can't be a Philip III, the infant, the future Philip III, because he's not born until 1578. So then the question is, well, who is it? And here you get to play with a lot of genealogical charts of the Spanish nobility, and so far nothing has really worked out. Because by the time Sofonisba gets to Spain, Don Carlos, whom we've seen here before, is already about 10 years old, or 12 years old, in fact, 11 or 12 years old. So he obviously is too old to be the boy in this picture. Don Filippo, that is to say the future Philip III, his short-lived brother Don Diego, and the other members of the royal family are not yet born. The Habsburg cousins who come from the court in Prague to Madrid don't usually arrive in Madrid until they're also 10 or 11 years old. So we're as yet unable to find a prominent young aristocrat, someone who would be worthy of the attentions of this lady-in-waiting, Sofonisba, who would have this fancy costume to have been painted by her. This, we hope, could be resolved in time. One of the keys may well be this medallion that the boy in the picture wears. It looks like a golden fleece, the most important of all the Spanish ceremonial orders, but on close examination, and trust me, I've had a blow-up of this hanging over my desk for the last year, it's certainly not a golden fleece. It's some other order which has yet to be identified. I'm also hoping to get this information, the detail of this, and even of this dagger to someone in Madrid at the Royal Armoury Works in the hope of figuring out, and this is not implausible, what this dagger, this jeweled dagger is, or what that medallion is. And so this is still very much a work in progress, a matter of research, and the hope that someone will be able to identify not by physiognomy, because after all he looks like all of the other Habsburgs, but instead by the jewels. He must be some secondary member of the family, not the son, not one of the sons of King Philip II, but perhaps of one of the other princesses or some splinter branch of the family, and that work still needs to be done. But I think we can say confidently that this is a portrait done in the 1560s or very early 1570s at the Spanish court, and by this fascinating character, Sofonisba. Now, just to finish up the story with her and give you an idea of how important Sofonisba is, even though she never attains the position of royal painter or anything like that, she eventually marries a Sicilian, or rather the brother of the Spanish viceroy in Sicily, and leaves the Spanish court, goes to Sicily, paints in Palermo for a time. When her first husband dies, she marries a Genoese nobleman and moves to Genoa, but keeps going back and forth to Sicily. And much, much later, in 1624, when she's in her 90s, she is visited by Anthony van Dyck. And there's a kind of amazing continuity of the arts there. To think of Van Dyck, whom we associate with Flanders and England and what seems another age entirely, when he goes to Palermo, he seeks out the old Sofonisba, meets her, writes an account of this in his sketchbook, and makes a drawing, which seems to be the basis for this painting of the 96-year-old Sofonisba in Palermo, in what seems like another age entirely. Van Dyck in his sketchbook notes she was still very much interested in painting and very sharp in mind. So it's a fascinating story and an interesting painting, and a painting that I think we can still find more about, and also one that, with conservation, will become an even more arresting subject. This picture has had almost no work done to it since the time it arrived at the museum in 1935. You can see that some of the background damages have become more visible over time. The varnish is sort of flat. There's some rather ugly in-painting along the bottom edge, all of which we hope, again, to improve. So as part of the process of research and work on our collections, it's both finding out who it is, I think further clarifying who did the picture, and then improving its overall appearance. So there's still much more of the story still to come. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, pardon me for my unsophisticated question. If you don't know who is the author, and you also don't know who is on the paint, how do you know it's Spanish or Italian?
This style of dress, for one thing, the very high collar with the lace in this pattern, this belt, and then this setup of the picture with this sort of half-length figure against a very dark background, something you see again and again in Spain. Both the costume is Spanish and the format is a Spanish picture. There's nothing quite like that done in Italy. I mean, yes, there are many portraits of children done in Italy in the Renaissance, but the whole setup and the details of the costume all speak to the Spanish court instead. I mean, again, this could turn out not to be a Spaniard. It could turn out to be some other branch of the Habsburg family who's come to the court in Spain, which many of them did. It could turn out to be the son of the Italian ambassador. Who knows? I mean, that's where I'm hoping someone will be able to figure out the medallion, and we can go from there. I do feel confident, though, that even if it is by Sofonisba, it must be from her Spanish period, rather than, it doesn't look like any of the pictures she did. I mean, just to give you a quick comparison, rifling through my papers, well, this may be not so useful. Here's a self-portrait of Sofonisba as a girl back home in Cremona. And you see there's something very hieratic about Spanish portraiture, which you just don't get in Italy at the same time.
Whereabouts is the portrait of Sofonisba in the later years, like the 90s? Is that hanging someplace?
It is, at this very moment, hanging in an exhibition dedicated to Van Dyck in Sicily, which is at the Dulwich Gallery in London. It lives normally in one of the English country houses, maybe Knoll, but don't quote me on that. But it's in an English private collection. Okay, well, thank you. I'll come have a look.